stand down immediately. That is Elena Rostova.
Two security guards stood in front of a woman at the main gate of an airbase, blocking her path, demanding to see credentials she was reaching for a little too slowly for their liking, treating her with the kind of casual suspicion reserved for someone who clearly, in their eyes, didn't belong there. 90 seconds later, an air marshal walking past that same gate stopped dead in his tracks, looked directly at her, and said two words loud enough for the entire checkpoint to hear. "Sky Queen." And every single person at that gate suddenly understood they'd made a mistake they were about to regret for a very long time. If you love stories about the moment assumption collides head-on with reality, subscribe right now before we start, because what unfolded at that checkpoint became the story that whole base talked about for months. And I want you playing along with me. The second you think you know who she really was, drop your guess in the comments. Almost nobody gets there before I explain it. Let's go back to the beginning, to a major airbase hosting an international joint exercise. Names and identifying details altered throughout this retelling to protect the privacy of everyone involved. On a morning when security at the main gate was operating under heightened and somewhat frazzled protocols due to the scale of the visiting personnel that week, the woman at the center of this story arrived at that gate a little before 8 in the morning, driving a rental vehicle, dressed in plain civilian clothes rather than a uniform, carrying a set of credentials that, on the surface, looked unremarkable to the two junior security personnel working the checkpoint that morning. Her name, for this story, was Wing Commander Layla Farrow, 41 years old, an experienced pilot with a service record considerably more distinguished than anything visible from where she was standing at that gate, waiting patiently while two guards examined her ID with a level of scrutiny that quickly tipped over from routine into something closer to suspicion. The heightened security posture that week wasn't unreasonable on its own terms. The base was hosting a large multinational exercise involving visiting personnel from several allied air forces, and checkpoint staff had been specifically briefed to verify all civilian-dressed arrivals with extra care given the unusually high volume of unfamiliar faces passing through that week. But somewhere in the translation of that briefing into actual behavior at the gate, caution had curdled into something less defensible. The two guards on duty that morning, a junior airman named Corey Blevins and a slightly more senior colleague, looked at a woman in plain clothes, driving alone, presenting credentials that didn't immediately match the uniformed, clearly marked visiting delegations they'd been processing all morning, and decided, without much further thought, that she warranted an unusually aggressive round of questioning. Here's a question I want you to sit with while we keep going, because I want your honest answer in the comments later. How much do you think first impressions at a checkpoint, at a job interview, anywhere really, are shaped by things that have nothing to do with who someone actually is? Because this story is about to make that gap uncomfortably obvious for two young security guards who really should have known better. What Blevins and his colleague didn't know, because her credentials, while entirely valid, weren't the kind of thing a junior gate guard was necessarily trained to immediately recognize at a glance, was that Layla Farrow held a service record built over nearly 2 decades, including an unusually distinguished specialization in high-altitude reconnaissance and advanced tactical flight operations, a career that had earned her, among pilots and commanders who'd flown alongside or under her leadership, a reputation few active-duty officers ever achieve. She had, several years earlier, led a technically complex, high-risk operational mission that had become something of a legend within specific aviation circles. a mission during which she had personally piloted a damaged aircraft through conditions that, according to the official assessment written afterward, tested the outer limits of both the airframe and the pilot, successfully completing an objective that 2 other aircraft in that same operation had been forced to abort. It was during the debrief following that particular mission that a senior officer, reviewing her performance with a mixture of professional respect and genuine astonishment, had given her the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career, only half-jokingly at first, and then with increasing seriousness as it spread through the community of pilots who'd heard the story. Sky Queen. Not an official call sign in the formal sense, more a reputation that had calcified into something close to a title, used by pilots and commanders across multiple units who'd either flown with her directly or simply heard, secondhand, exactly what she was capable of in the air. None of that meant anything to 2 junior security guards looking at a civilian-dressed woman's ID at a gate on an unusually busy morning. To them, she was simply someone whose credentials didn't immediately fit the pattern of what they were expecting to see, and in the absence of context, that ambiguity got filled with suspicion rather than the benefit of the doubt. The questioning at the gate escalated over the following several minutes in a way that, by Layla's own later account, felt less like standard security procedure and more like an accumulating series of small indignities. She was asked to explain her reason for being on base in a tone that implied disbelief rather than genuine inquiry. She was asked to wait while her credentials were run through additional verification, a request that, while procedurally defensible, was delivered, according to a witness waiting in the vehicle behind her, like they were expecting to catch her in a lie. At one point, according to that same witness, Blevins's colleague made a comment to him, not quite quiet enough, suggesting they should probably search her vehicle before letting her through, a level of scrutiny considerably beyond what other uniformed arrivals were receiving that same morning. Layla, throughout all of this, remained calm and cooperative, answering every question directly, providing every piece of documentation requested, and making no attempt to invoke rank or reputation to speed the process along. A restraint that, in hindsight, several people who later heard the story found almost remarkable given who she actually was and how easily she could have short-circuited the entire situation the moment it started to feel unreasonable. That brings us to the moment that changed everything, roughly 6 minutes into an interaction that should have taken under 2. An air marshal, a senior officer overseeing the broader multinational exercise that week, a man whose own career had intersected with Layla's on more than one occasion over the years, happened to be walking toward the gate at exactly that moment, moving between different sections of the base as part of his own busy morning schedule. He noticed the small commotion at the checkpoint, the way most senior officers instinctively notice anything unusual happening on their base, and glanced over out of simple situational awareness rather than any specific concern. What happened next, according to 4 separate witnesses who were present at the checkpoint that morning, unfolded within the space of about 10 seconds. The air marshal's glance toward the checkpoint turned into a full stop, his expression shifting rapidly from mild curiosity to unmistakable recognition, and he changed direction entirely, walking briskly toward the gate with a purpose that immediately signaled to everyone nearby that something significant was happening. He reached the checkpoint, looked directly at Layla, and said, loudly enough that both guards and several other personnel nearby heard it clearly, "Sky Queen? Is that actually you?" And then, without waiting for a full answer, turned to the 2 visibly startled security guards and asked, in a tone that had shifted instantly from friendly recognition to something considerably sharper, exactly what was happening and why one of the most respected pilots currently associated with that exercise was being held up at his own gate like a suspicious civilian. The checkpoint, according to witnesses, went almost completely silent in the several seconds that followed. The particular silence of two young security personnel realizing, in real time, exactly how badly they'd misjudged the situation in front of them. Blevins, according to one account, actually took a half step backward, visibly processing the gap between how he'd been treating her and what the air marshal's reaction was telling him about who she actually was. The air marshal, once he'd confirmed that no serious security concern actually existed, and that the delay had been driven by nothing more than an overcautious, poorly calibrated read of an unfamiliar face, made a point of personally escorting Layla through the checkpoint himself, engaging her in warm, clearly genuine conversation as they walked, the kind of easy familiarity that made unmistakably clear to everyone still watching exactly how significant a figure had just been standing at that gate, being treated with unwarranted suspicion. Before walking off with her, according to two witnesses, the air marshal turned back briefly to address the two guards directly. Not with anger exactly, but with the kind of measured, pointed correction that clearly landed harder than shouting would have. He reminded them, in front of the small crowd that had gathered by that point, that security protocols existed to keep the base safe, not to subject people to unnecessary scrutiny based on assumptions about who looked like they belonged and who didn't, and that the difference between the two was a distinction every person working that checkpoint needed to internalize far better than they clearly had that morning. Word of what had happened at that gate spread through the base with the particular speed that stories involving a senior officer publicly correcting checkpoint behavior tend to travel. Especially once people started asking who exactly Sky Queen was, and started hearing, for the first time for many of them, the actual details of the mission that had earned her that reputation years earlier. By that afternoon, according to several personnel who described the mood on base that day, Layla Farrow had gone, in the span of a few hours, from an unfamiliar civilian-dressed face at a checkpoint to easily one of the most talked-about people currently on base for that exercise. Layla herself, by all accounts, handled the sudden attention with the same understated composure she'd shown throughout the entire incident at the gate. She didn't make a public issue of how she'd been treated, didn't push for any formal complaint against the two guards involved, and when asked directly by a few curious personnel over the following days about what had happened, tended to downplay the incident considerably more than the people retelling it to each other clearly wanted her to. Base leadership, informed of the incident later that same day through channels that made clear the air marshal's public correction at the gate had already made the point fairly effectively, used the situation as an informal but pointed teaching moment for the base's broader security staff. A reminder circulated in the following days that appropriate caution and unfounded suspicion are not the same thing, and that checkpoint personnel needed to be considerably more careful about the difference going forward. Corey Blevins, the junior guard most visibly caught up in the moment, reportedly requested, on his own initiative, a brief meeting with Layla in the days that followed, offering a direct, apparently sincere apology for how the interaction at the gate had unfolded. Layla, according to the one witness who was present for part of that conversation, accepted the apology graciously, reportedly telling him that she understood the pressure of an unusually busy security week, but that she hoped he'd remember, going forward, that the person standing in front of him at any checkpoint could always be someone whose actual record he had absolutely no way of knowing just by looking. What strikes me most about this story isn't really the 10 seconds it took for the air marshal's arrival to completely upend how that checkpoint was treating her, dramatic as that moment undeniably was. It's the 6 minutes before it. 6 minutes of one of the most respected pilots associated with that entire exercise being treated with a level of suspicion that had almost nothing to do with any actual security concern, and almost everything to do with the fact that she simply didn't match an unconscious mental picture of who belonged on that base and who didn't. She never once used her reputation to shortcut the situation herself. It took someone else recognizing her, entirely by chance, for the truth of who she actually was to catch up with how she was being treated. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want your honest answer in the comments below. Do you think Layla should have said something earlier at that gate? Invoked her rank or reputation the moment the questioning started feeling excessive, instead of quietly enduring it until someone else stepped in? Or do you think the entire responsibility for what happened rests with the guards who let an unfamiliar face justify treatment that clearly crossed a line? Tell me honestly where you land, and tell me, before the reveal, did you already suspect she was going to turn out to be someone considerably more significant than she looked at that gate? If this story kept you hooked, hit subscribe before you go, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. The ones who get underestimated by the very system meant to protect them, right up until someone finally recognizes exactly who's standing in front of them. And if there's a story like this you want covered next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.